You're listening to the Pulled by the Root podcast.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pulled by the Root podcast. Today is a very special day for me. Mirah Riben is here. I connected her right when I was coming to terms with my adoption. My co-author, Dr. Elisa Zalma, sent me an article that Mirah had written for the Huff Post about adoption and moral injury. And as I was reading that article, I felt my subconscious being dismantled. And I literally held that article in my hands and felt the grip of what it meant to be adopted. And to be able to have Mirah's support during this book project and this platform that we're building, it has just been such a gift, Mirah, to have you as a source of support and strength during this when you're going through a lot on your own. And I'd like to read Mirah's bio before we get into speaking with her. Mirah Riben is the author of 2 internationally acclaimed books, Shedding Light on the Dark Side of Adoption and The Stork Market, America's Unregulated Multi-Billion-Dollar Adoption Industry. She has also written more than 230 articles appearing in such publications as the Huffington Post, Medium, Dissident Voice, Crime Magazine, Courier Post, Conducive Magazine, USA Today, to name a few. As a proponent of social justice and human rights with a focus on the rights of mothers, fathers, and children and families in crisis since 1980, Mirah is investigating, researching, and writing to expose the corruption, coercion, exploitation, commodification, and trafficking of children in the mega billion-dollar adoption industry, anonymous contract conception, and surrogacy industries, in favor of family preservation and replacing current adoption practices with simple adoption or permanent legal guardianship, to end the falsification of birth certificates that claim adoptees were born to their adopters and restore equal access for adoptees who have been issued fraudulent birth certificates. She is in opposition of all profiteering in adoption. She also wants to expose the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse in adopted families, including children rehomed, abandoned, murdered by those committed to protect and care for them. To end pre-birth matching and expenses paid directly from prospective adopters to expectant mothers. These practices, currently allowable in many states, are simply a ruse for human trafficking and have no place in child welfare. They enmesh expectant mothers considering adoption and those seeking to adopt, creating false expectations for hopeful adopters and feelings of obligation and indebtedness for mothers to be. Well, Mirah, wow.
It's a lot, isn't it?
You must be tired. Oh my goodness.
Well, the fact is, Heidi, that it spanned over 40 years and you're condensing it into, a 5-minute, it's a lot. It is a lot.
Well, it's just, there's so many moments I've had with you that I'd like to share, but I'd like to start with the fact that acknowledging that you are a pioneer. And I know when I wanted to brag about that with you, your response was so humble. You said, yes, but, and I'll let you finish that sentence because I think it's an important moment to recognize the hard work of all of the women and men who went before us.
Exactly. I'm one of many. Within this, as far as women, the movement was started by 2 of the greatest women, which is Jean Payton on the West Coast with Orphan Voyage, and Florence Fisher, who started Alma in New York City. They started the adoptee movement. It was later on that the birth parent movement was birthed by Lee Campbell, who started CUB, Concerned United Birth Parents. And I was there from the very beginning of that. And just trying to think of other birth moms that have been around as long as I have. would be Sandy Musser, who's written 2 books. Lorraine Dusky, who's written 2 books as well. All of these, those are just the birth mothers in the movement, the long time, the old timers who have been around, who paved the path. And I do just want to acknowledge all of them, because, it takes a village. Nobody does this on their own. And
yeah. Well, thank you, Mirah, for speaking their names. That is really important. And just to speak about birth mothers for a second, then we're going to dive deep into your advocacy. I really feel like our platform, what we want to create is not exclusivity. We want to hear from all sides, all parties. We want to hear the anger. We want to hear the pain. And for me personally, I feel like it's very relevant to start with the birth mothers, because that is where the trauma starts. It is that hard, like that difficult experience where a mother gives up their child. I just want to acknowledge that I think that we need to have conversations with birth mothers also and understand their perspective in the adoption community.
Yeah, I wonder if I would agree that it starts with the birth mother, or
probably not.
Or if it starts with the pressure that starts from the demand.
Ooh.
Yeah, all of adoption is demand driven. And without the demand, none of us, mothers or adoptees, would have suffered the trauma of loss and separation. So, yeah. But I know that you wanted to talk about the birth parent experience because it is different from your experience as an adoptee. The birth parent experience is one that has spanned decades and has changed over time because our social mores around sexuality and unwed motherhood changed so much over my lifetime, the 50s, the 60s, and into the 70s. It got this label, and the reason for that is simple. The sexual revolution preceded the birth control. People have been sexually active since Adam and Eve. Let's face it. The baby boomers of the 60s did not invent sex, but it did start at younger ages than it had in our parents' generation. And there was a lack of birth control to prevent pregnancies. But it was still considered very, very sinful. And all of the sin and all of the shame was cast on the mothers, of course, not the men who got us pregnant. I mean, we didn't do it alone, but
I know.
they got totally off the hook, and we got slammed with all the guilt and the shame. We were cast into, in that time period, in the 50s and 60s, most young women who got pregnant were sent away, either to live with an aunt out of state during the course of their pregnancy, or a great majority were sent to homes for unwed mothers. And the most fabulous book anybody can read to understand the experience of birth mothers, especially during that particular time period in history, is Ann Fessler's The Girls Who Went Away. Talks about young teenage girls being hidden in closets when company knocked at the door. Their parents, they weren't ashamed. The girls themselves were not ashamed either of having sex or of being pregnant, but their parents were. And there's another good book called Wake Up Little Susie by Ricky Solinger, which was my wake-up call, because I recognized for the first time after reading that book that it wasn't just me, it was the entire social atmosphere that this happened to me in. And Ricky Solinger describes also the racial disparity that from that time until the present, Black families were much more accommodating and much more even insistent upon keeping a child within the family. It was a horrifying thought to them to let a child go, but it was the white middle class, the upper rising, our parents, most of our parents from my parents' generation were immigrants, either first or second generation immigrants. And it was very important for them to fit in and be accepted by their neighbors and by their community. And so this shame that was brought upon them by their daughter doing this horrible thing of becoming pregnant without marriage had to be hidden away and hushed up. And so that's what happened to a good many of us. Now you flash forward to today, and things have changed drastically. The biggest change besides birth control and availability of abortion, because I really don't think abortion has a whole lot to do with adoption one way or the other, because it's so time limited. And it's foolish to think that single women are considering abortion much more than married women are. So the single most different thing besides birth control, access to birth control, was the biggest. The second one was the acceptance of single parenthood. It was during, I think, don't quote me on this, I'm not a fact-oriented person. I always have to research and look up my facts before I write my articles and books. So I'm not good at extemporaneous speaking because of that. But I think it was sometime during the early 70s or so that birth control first became available, maybe the late 60s. Birth control first became available to single women. Prior to that, it was only available to married women. But the other biggest change was as I said, the acceptance of single parenthood and allowing young women to continue their schooling while pregnant. That was an amazing change. Some schools at the time, what they did at first was they put trailers in the back of the high schools. Yeah, and set up segregated classrooms for the expectant mothers. Well, they didn't want it to be contagious, they didn't want—
God forbid.
Yeah. They didn't want the acceptance of it to spread it, Oh, well, now it's cool, we can be pregnant, so let's all go out and, have yay sex and, unprotected sex. So they wanted to allow them education, but they kept them a bit segregated at first. And then it was a gradual integration into mainstream schooling. But that was a very big change. And, you had Women's Lib at the time was having consciousness raising parties, and Betty Friedan, and, they were speaking out on delaying your career and waiting to have a family, but also they were speaking out and accepting career women who were having babies. You had Murphy, what's her name? The TV show.
Oh yeah, Murphy Brown. I love
Murphy
that show.
Brown,
Yes.
right.
Yes.
Murphy Brown introduced the whole world to, gee whiz, a woman can get pregnant without being married, continue her career, and be a respectable human being. She didn't have to be cast off like a leper. So there were all these changes happening. And now we get to today. And well, let me back up first. Let me back up. During all of that time, there was enormous pressure, of course, on these women. They were not just sent away, but the way that they were forced into and told that they could erase the sin of fornication was to give up the baby and forget about it like it never happened. You never spoke of it because this was a sinful thing in your past, and you never were to speak of it. You never were to tell even the man that you were going to marry, because he probably wouldn't want to marry. I was told this. I myself was told these words. He probably would not want to marry you if he knew. Now, here's the irony. On the one hand, we're being told this is the noble thing to do, the right thing to do, the unselfish, the loving thing to do. And then on the other hand, we're being told by nuns, by priests, because that's who ran a lot of these homes for unwed mothers. And they were the ones telling the young girls, don't ever tell anyone. The girls that I didn't go, but the girls that went to the homes for unwed mothers were sequestered. They were almost imprisoned, and they were told not to tell the other girls their real names. They were given pseudonyms. This is this cloak of secrecy that hung over all of this entire process. And the other cloak that hung over was pressure. Pressure, pressure, pressure. If you love this baby, you will give this baby away. There are others that are more deserving than you. And when I look back now, the one most destructive thing to my self-esteem, which was already at a pretty low ebb when this happened, to be told there are people more deserving than you to have your own child is just beyond crushing. It is absolutely, totally destroying of any thread of self-esteem that you had left at that point. It took me decades to recover, and I'm still recovering from those words being said to me, and I'm just one of many. Yeah, you asked me before we went live how much of my own story I wanted to tell. And the truth is that if you look at all my 2 books and my hundreds of articles, none of them are biographical. And there's a reason, autobiographical. There's a reason for that. The reason is that part of my shame, I never felt that my story was typical or classic or evoked any sympathy, because I wasn't a very young teenager. I wasn't 15 or 16. I couldn't say I was forced by my parents. I was already in my early 20s, and that added shame to me. I mean, back then, women were all married and settling down and having families in their 20s. And here I was, this loose woman doing this thing, and I had no one to blame. So I never focused on my own story. It was very atypical. I wasn't in a home for unwed mothers. There were many things about it that made it atypical. And I just saw more importance in telling the story of the whole rather than my own. I didn't place any great importance on writing my memoir, which is so popular amongst both adoptees and birth parents, but I never did that. From the very, very beginning, from very early on, as I said, I was involved with CUB, Concerned United Birth Parents, and then myself and 3 or 4 other mothers here in New Jersey, we got together and we made a decision to start our own support group and to break away from CUB. And one of the reasons we chose to break away was we did see it as a woman's issue. And CUB, of course, is Concerned United Birth Parents. And we didn't see too many fathers involved back then. Now I know of a handful that are adamantly fighting for custody for their children, and bravo to them, and we welcome them with open. But back then, I guess the feminist in me got to me or whatever, and we co-founded, the 4 or 5 of us, the original Origins. This dates back before Origins of Canada and Origins of Australia. We were the first Origins. We started in 1980 in New Jersey, and the subtitle of our group, which was on our monthly newsletter, which went national, even though we were a New Jersey-based group, our subtitle was Origins, an organization for women who have lost children to adoption. We were also the first to coin the phrase lost. We didn't want to say we gave up children. We didn't want to say, any of the other terms. We felt closest to our heart. We knew we had lost our children. So we started this self-help support group for mothers. And we met in members' homes, we met in libraries and such like that. And now I have gotten myself absolutely, totally off track on a tangent.
I love no, Mirah, this is so wonderful. It is really an education to hear. There's so much historical value. So please
I know
don't
where
feel
I
like
was
it's a
going.
tangent.
I do know where I was going. So way back then, in the late 70s, early 80s, when I found these other women and formed this group. Now, I had relinquished my daughter was born in 67 and relinquished in 68. I had kept her in foster care for 6 months because I was trying desperately to be able to keep her, but I was getting no support to do that. My parents were in total agreement with the social workers. You have to put this behind you and get on with your life. My father's exact words to me were, this child will be an albatross. And again, no one would want to marry you. So I had no support. So she was relinquished in 68. And then I started the support group the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s. So she was a young teenager at the time. And this is before the internet, mind you. This was long before the internet. And yet I am reading in newspapers articles about adoptees being abused and even murdered by their adoptive parents. Well, the shock waves were incomprehensible because the way they get us to agree to sign the relinquishment is by constantly, these words that I said, you're doing the unselfish thing, the loving thing, and other people deserve, but they also kept pounding into us that there are people that want a child so desperately and will love this child and will take, the child will have a better life for having been adopted. That was one of the key phrases. The reason to do this was to selflessly let our children have a better life. After all, you're a single mother. What kind of life can you give your child? You'll be struggling. They quoted statistics to us about children of single moms, fatherless children, and how they all wound up drug addicts and horrible things happen. And here you could give them this better life. And now, 10, 12, 15 years later, I'm reading, because at the time when I signed the papers, then I had this, for the first 10 years, I lived in a bubble. And I literally pictured my daughter in this castle, like adoptees have their fantasies of their
Yeah, the
princess.
ghost kingdom. Oh,
The
Mirah.
ghost kingdom, right. Adoptees have the fantasy of their birth mothers being an actress or a princess. And I had this vision that they created for me. She was Rapunzel in the window in the castle. She had this charmed life because that was the whole reason I made this horrible sacrifice. I did something that went against your human grain as a human being, to give away your own flesh and blood. And I did it so she would have this better life. Now I start reading news reports, and it finally dawns on me, there's no guarantee. Adoptive parents are human beings. They divorce, leaving their children again with a single parent, which adoption was supposed to rectify. They die, leaving their children again alone, abandoned. And they abuse. That was the biggest shock. And so I started collecting these news clippings. I started cutting them out, and I was reporting them in our newsletter, our Origins newsletter, and sharing them with Cub and sharing them wherever I could share them. Again, no internet to share it with. But I was collecting these stories, to my great horror. Had a drawer full of them. And that's when I knew I had to put them all together into a book. And that's how my first book was created, shedding light on the dark side of adoption. Because I said, the public is totally unaware of this. And still are to this day, by the way, even though I've been exposing it since the 1980s. The public is still walking around with rose-colored glasses, that adoption is this win-win and children are afforded a better life. Yes, most are. Most get a more affluent life. If you can, it's a trade-off. They lose a lot. They lose their entire connection to their ancestry and heredity and et cetera, and they suffer a primal wound trauma. They lose a lot. They pay a high price. But yes, most have a more affluent life, if you want to call that a better life. But there's no guarantee. And adoptive parents are no more perfect than anyone else. And so I wrote this entire book to try and wake up the world that there is a dark side to adoption. It is not perfect. It is not all roses and unicorns and rainbows. And that book was published in 1988. I had a connection, by the way, at Simon & Schuster.
Ooh, that's a good connection, Mirah.
Pretty good connection, yeah.
Yeah, just a little bit good.
I had been submitting the book. And piling up another whole drawer full of rejection letters. I was told it's too academic for the general public. It's too general for an academic press. I was given all kinds of, mostly it won't sell. And here was the truth that I was told. I had this in, and the person who gave me the in said to me, I can get it read. Beyond that, of course. And I said, oh, sure, absolutely, I understand. So it was read by Schuster of Simon & Schuster. And I still have his letter to this day. And what he said to me was, it's very well researched, very well written, which every one of my rejection letters said, but it won't sell. And the reason it won't sell is because the general public does not want to hear these ugly truths. Because, he said, adoption is our fallback position. It's our safety net. So what they were saying to me is they wanted to keep the blinders on, and they wanted to silence people like me who were trying to expose the truth. I mean, that happens, Happens all the time. Look what happens in industry and in the environmental world. People who are truth tellers are silenced. And let us not forget that there is enormous amounts of money being made in adoption. Babies, white, healthy babies, go for approximately $40,000 each. That's a lot of incentive to pressure expectant mothers. That's a lot of incentive to keep this going. In sometime in the 90s, I forget exactly what year, I went to Guatemala, because Guatemala was one of the first international sources of adopted babies to speak out. I mean, they weren't one of the first sources. Korea was, let's be clear about that. But Guatemala was one of the first to attempt, and then finally did, close it down altogether because of corruption. Guatemala is a very, very corrupt country. There's a lot of crime. When I went there, I went with a human rights expedition, and we were told, if we have any problems, don't call the police, because the police are so corrupt. They said,
you might end up somewhere you don't want to be.
In any trouble, call the fire department. Isn't that amazing?
That's interesting.
And I was on this human rights expedition, and we were taken on a tour and shown all the places where human rights activists had been killed by the gang members. It's a very, very dangerous and corrupt place. And I was there because there were 4 mothers on strike because their children had been kidnapped. It was widespread all over Guatemala. Babies were being kidnapped and stolen at gunpoint or coerced through lies. Oh, a very sweet neighborly lady would say, oh, I'll watch your child for you while you go take care of your chores. And the child would never be seen again, because there was so much money in this corruption. And one of the things, this is the point of my whole long story, one of the things I was told while I was there, we were told that the drug dealers, many of the drug cartels, had changed over to trafficking babies for adoption for 2 reasons. There was more money in it and less chance of getting arrested for it. Because, as I said, the police were right in with the corruption. These mothers that were on hunger strikes to get their babies back, when they went to the police and said my baby was stolen, they were basically laughed at. It was kind of like claiming rape back in the 50s. Oh, you must have wanted it. It was that type of attitude from the police. They accused the mothers of selling their babies. And so the mothers were not believed that their children were kidnapped. So it was a very, very sad state of affairs. And I'm really, it was quite an experience to go there and see that. But to learn that there's more money in trafficking babies for adoption, that's quite a statement. And it tells you why fighting against it is so hard. And because this is not just criminals that are involved, but like I said, the police, and here stateside, it's run by attorneys. These are well-established, well-respected. All the adoption agencies are highly regarded and highly respected, and nobody would suspect that they would. And we don't know for sure. The adoption agencies that deal with less and less today, fortunately, that deal with international adoption, we don't know for sure how much they know or don't know about the origins of the children that they're sending overseas. David Smolin, has written some ingenious material. He's an adoptive father who, he and his wife were what's called preferential adopters. They already had their own children. They adopted with the intent of doing a good deed and rescuing a child from an impoverished country, and giving them the advantages that they could give them. And so they adopted two little girls from India, two young girls, not very little, two young girls. And once the children were adept enough in English, they told their mom and dad that they had been stolen from their parents. And they were horrified, needless to say, because they had thought that they were doing a good deed. And they were absolutely horrified. David Smolin, as a result of his personal experience with this, he was already an attorney and a law professor, as a matter of fact, still is a law professor. And he was so, his whole life was so turned around by this that he became one of, if not the world's leading expert on child trafficking for adoption. And here's what happens. Here's what happens. The crooks either steal or kidnap or coerce a child from a mother. They then sell the child to some kind of a children's home, telling them that this child was found abandoned on the church steps, and no questions are asked. And there's no way to trace it back to find out. So he calls it child laundering because, like money laundering, the children go through one process after another. And so there's really no way of knowing for sure how much the stateside agencies know or don't know about the true origins of these children. They know what they were told by the foster parents in the children's homes overseas. And they were told the child was abandoned or orphaned. So, yeah, these are the horrors of adoption. These are.
It is, Mirah, it's just listening to you. I don't know, every muscle in my body is knotted, because to think that we're ignoring this as a global community. And I'm still hearing stories today about this. This is not a past issue. Yes, I think it's getting better, as you stated. Yeah, it's like, I think that's what's so terrifying.
It's far from past. Let me now zoom right to the present.
Let's do it.
Nowadays, in the new millennium, shame is no longer a tool that can be used on an expectant mother. No one's ashamed of being pregnant anymore, whether you're married or not married. There's no shame to it. So they had to come up with a new device. And that new device was open adoption. And they now convince mothers, you will, and also because mothers of my generation had by now started speaking out. And not only have we spoken out, but people have spoken out on our behalf and written many, many professional journal articles on the lifelong grief of losing a child to adoption. You don't get over it. You don't get on with your life. You don't just forget it and never mention it again. And so now they have to convince younger mothers. First of all, there's fewer of them because of single parenthood and access to birth control. So there's fewer mothers going through with an unintended pregnancy. So the pressure is greater than ever, not less, but greater, because there are fewer of them. And how do they pressure these women? They can't use shame. So now they tell them, you will not suffer the way the mothers of the past generation did, because you will have an open adoption and you will get to see and know your child, and your child will get to see and know you. And this will erase all the pain. This will be a painless process. I mean, it's like telling somebody, we're going to cut off your arm, but you can watch while we do it. So that's going to alleviate.
Yeah, that'll be wonderful.
I mean, it's absolutely absurd. First of all, a lot of it, if I can, I mean, the FCC doesn't censor these, right? So I can speak bluntly. A lot of it is just out and out bullshit when they're promised open adoptions, because there's no way to enforce it. Every adoption, whether it's opened or closed, still begins with the mother signing a relinquishment of her parental rights. The mother and father both relinquish all parental rights. Therefore, they're presenting open adoption to very young, very naive women who are hearing what they want to hear. And what they're hearing is, this is going to be like joint custody after a divorce. I'm going to be like a Sunday mother. I won't have the burden. And they tell them this. You can get on with your life. You can go back to school if they're very young, or if they're older, you can go on with your career, but you'll get to see your child. So they're going to be this Sunday father that we used to talk about in divorce. You're going to be the friendly aunt who comes and brings gifts and spoils the child. This is their image of open adoption. They're not explained the details that open adoption is a continuum. It begins with what is actually literally called identified adoption, which is where the birth mother and the prospective adoptive mother meet. They may or may not exchange names and identifying information. They may just meet through a middleman, an attorney, a facilitator, whatever. They may or may not exchange names and any other further identifying information. That's one end of the continuum, and they call it open adoption because they may meet once or twice. Some of them stay in contact during the whole pregnancy, and that creates other problems. That creates an enmeshment so that the birth mother feels this debt to have to go through with it, even though she changes her mind later on during the pregnancy or after the birth. But she's already enmeshed. This prospective adoptive mother came with her to every visit to the OB/GYN. They heard the heartbeat together. So that's one aspect of it. And the other is that it runs the gamut from just knowing who they are. Some of them are semi-open adoption, but they're not explained, these differences. So they're identified on one end, then semi-open, where they might exchange letters, which may or may not have photos of the child. And way, way at the other end of the spectrum are a handful that are truly, truly open adoption, where the birth mother gets to visit. Now, the other thing that they're not told, when I gave the analogy of cutting your arm off and watching it, a lot of mothers find it too painful to watch their child running into the arms of somebody else and mommy, mommy, mommy. That's awfully painful, especially on a raw wound that just happened. Then the other thing, most importantly, that they're not told is that all of open adoption, because it begins with a total relinquishment of rights, the adoptive parents have all the rights and the mothers have no rights. It is a promise. It is an unenforceable promise. She could never say, well, they promised me an open adoption and they reneged on it, and they're not allowing me to see the child. You go to a judge and a judge says, well, you signed away your rights. They have the right to make the decision. And of course, the adoptive parents will always give the judge some reason It was 99% of the time. The child found it the visits were upsetting. The child would cry after the visits. It was way too upsetting for him. So we want to stop the visits. And a judge is always going to side in their favor. They have all the rights in their bucket and the mother has none. So open adoption is just another whole big lie to pressure people. It's a new selling point. Used to be shame, and now it's open adoption. It's a farce, and many, many women are falling for it and feeling betrayed. There are several Facebook groups of mothers who entered into open adoption and are utterly destroyed and betrayed. And they will tell you that they never would have allowed for the adoption had they known it would have been a closed adoption. They never would have agreed to a closed adoption. They were duped into believing that they would have this open adoption. And so that brings it right up to date. So they're still lying to women and pressuring them and coercing them into giving up babies because there's money in redistributing babies from the young and the powerless to the people with money. And that's it. The babies, the adoptees, are commodities, and they're commodities with a high price tag on their head, depending on age and skin color and health. We know this for a fact. I could show you, I could send you, we have a price list that appears online. I forget the name of the agency right now, but they have the fees set. These are the fees for adopting a white baby, and these are the fees for adopting a baby of color. And there's quite a difference between them. So it's a business. The babies are commodities, and the mothers are merely the wrappings that the commodity comes in, and they can be discarded afterward, even if they were promised open adoption. They're just, oh, well, we're not going to keep some of them don't even give excuses. Some of them, when they arrange the adoption through an intermediary, usually an attorney, the mother's only contact with them during the pregnancy is an 800 number, which gets disconnected the minute they get the baby in their arms. So some of them are betrayed right from minute one.
Oh.
Nasty, nasty business adoption is. And yet the general public sees it as this magnanimous, altruistic, and that it helps the mothers too, because the mothers didn't want their babies and now they get a chance to get on with their lives. That's the perception of adoption. That's why they call it a win-win. The mother wins. She gets to get on with her life. That's what she wanted. She didn't want this baby. They have to believe that. I think that adoptive parents and the attorneys and facilitators really believe those lies. They have to, because otherwise they couldn't look themselves in the mirror, knowing that these were wanted babies that were coerced away and pressured away from their mothers. They don't want to believe that. They want to believe that the mothers were unfit in some way, didn't want their baby. And the lie is certified and sealed with the state's approval when the state seals away the adoptee's original birth certificate and issues a falsified birth certificate claiming that they were born to their adoptive parents. Now, this is I don't know how much time we have.
No, we need to keep going because I
Okay.
think it's so amazing, Mirah.
I
Because
can
the
keep
next
going
thing,
forever. So you
yeah,
need to let me know.
no, I
Give me a
will.
signal when we're running out of time.
No, I
Now
think
let me see if I can pick up my train of thought here again.
no, the adoptees, like the adoptees' rights or their
Falsified birth
certificate.
certificate.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about that is that that state by state, the adoptees are going about trying to open the records and get them access when they're adults. Meanwhile, they can go through their whole adolescence with their hearts torn out, but they can get their certificates back when they're adults. Okay. The interesting thing is that in almost every state where they're attempting to do this, birth mothers are being blamed for why they were sealed. They were sealed to protect the anonymity of the birth mother. Well, again, that is sheer and utter baloney, okay? No birth mother ever asked for or expected anonymity, maybe from the maybe confidentiality from the public, but not anonymity from her own child. She never asked for it. She was never given it. And furthermore, she couldn't be given it because, think about it, relinquishment and adoption are two separate events. They happen time separated, okay? So at the time she relinquishes her rights, there's no way of knowing if that child is ever going to be adopted. That child may be found to have physical or emotional defects and be classified special needs and may remain in foster care his entire life. Therefore, the birth certificate is never sealed because it only gets sealed at the time of the adoption. And there's this huge chunk of time in between. Usually takes approximately a year from even if the newborn baby is placed in the arms, as is done today, which is also another horrible thing because puppy dogs get to stay with their mothers for like 6 to 8 weeks. And newborn infants that are being placed for adoption are denied their mother's milk, which is healing, and all that's a whole other story. And and they suffer the primal wound, this terrible wrenching away from the sounds and smells and the rhythm of the mother in the womb. So nowadays they're grabbed right at birth, but the adoption is not finalized for a year. There's that time period in between, which is the time period when adoptive parents are scared to death that the birth mother might change her mind and come back and get the baby. So there's that whole time period where these birth certificates are not sealed, and no mother could have possibly been promised that it would be at the time she signs the relinquishment papers. It's just an impossibility and a lie. And yet the legislators believe this, and they claim that they're sealing the records to protect the mothers. Now, let me also tell you that they never were to begin with. Way back when they first became sealed in the 1940s, okay, it was very clear because the other shame, there was so much shame back in those dark days. There was also shame of infertility. Women did not discuss it like they do today, okay? You got married and you were supposed to have a baby. And if you didn't, you kept it a secret from people. You didn't walk around talking about it and going online and delineating your journey through IFV treatments and all that you're suffering. Nobody did that back then. It was a secret. In fact, parents were told, and social workers, they told us mothers never to tell anyone that we relinquished a child. And they told adoptive parents, don't tell your child that he's adopted, because that will make the child feel strange and awkward and different. That child is the same as if it were born to you, and no one needs to know any different. And that's how adoptive parents were counseled. They were told not to. That's why we have now also Facebook groups and probably some in-person groups somewhere of people called LDA, late discovery adoptees. They don't find out until they're adults because their parents back in the day listened to the advice of the social workers and never told them they were adopted. So they lived this whole false life, giving false medical information, mind you, okay? Infertility was a secret, and the child was given to them so they could pretend that this child was their child. Some adoptees my age have told stories I've heard at Alma meetings that their mothers walked around with pillows under their dresses while they were in the process of adopting and told their children stories of their delivery. I mean, this is the extent they went to. The lies in adoption are just never ending. And so it was to protect, not to protect the birth mothers, but to protect the adoptive mother's lie that the birth records were sealed in the 1940s. It was done by, if you read the adoption, there's a good adoption history website, and you could read all of this. It was done by people like Betsy Bernard, who were notorious baby brokers. She was selling babies, and there was another one, I can't remember the other name right now, that they were selling babies to a lot of Hollywood stars because they have the money. They have big, big money. And it was all done as a lie. They would steal the baby. They were baby brokering. They were human trafficking. They were selling babies to those who had a lot of money to buy it. And because they were not only selling to Hollywood stars, but also to influential people in their locale, in their town and in their state. They were selling babies to attorneys and to judges. And so they had contacts and they had power, and they got the law and legislators, judges and legislators, and they got the law to seal the adoptions, to protect them, to protect the baby brokers. That's who it was done to protect, and to protect the lie that the adoptive mother wanted to put forth, that this child was born to her, not snatched from somebody else and paid for and all of that. So it was a big conspiracy. It was initiated by the baby brokers, mostly to protect their own little cottage industry. And now we get blamed that we wanted this and that they're doing it to protect us so that we don't have to live the shame of being revealed. Well, let me clue you in. DNA is exposing all the secrets now.
Oh,
so
yeah. Oh, yeah.
All the dirty little secrets are coming out of the
gosh.
closet, and sealed records is not going to protect anyone anymore. So that's what happens to lies in the end. I mean, it took 40 years or more, but 40 years in my lifetime of doing this, but it took from the 1940s to now. But lies eventually come out and get uncovered.
Yes,
and
they do.
it's not a pretty picture when it does happen, because late discovery adoptees rightly so, feel a huge amount of betrayal. They almost always find out that all of their aunts, uncles, and cousins, and even neighbors knew. Everyone knew but them. And everyone was loyal to the adoptive parents and kept the secret, most often to the grave of the adoptive parent. Most late discovery adoptees don't find out until after their parents are dead. They find out at the funeral or afterward when they go through their parents' papers, and they'll find the adoption papers. So many lies, and so it's all a web of lies and secrecy. The whole thing is is a fantasy to take childless people and give them children and do it surreptitiously. That's adoption. That's
Mirah,
adoption. It's not rescuing children. It's filling a demand and doing it surreptitiously and through lies and betrayals, and it's a nasty, nasty business.
Mirah, there's no way to, I can't push back on one thing you said. It makes so much sense. But as we begin to wrap things up here, I remember a conversation we had. I was actually sitting out on the grass and I was talking to you, trying to sort this out in my head as an adoptee. And I would love for you to speak to the adoptees out there about this. I was talking to you about the great shame and the catastrophic results of me finding my birth family, that it cost me the relationship with my adopted mom, that I was so in the fog, that I was even in denial. I had even accepted the narrative. And there is a triad, but the baby is the most innocent in that. And I'm not saying that we should divide up suffering evenly or compare, but it just feels
there is no triad. There is no triad.
So please respond to that, because I think adoptees really need to hear. I don't know if validation is the right word, Mirah, but we are so shrouded in shame and accommodating to survive and not being rejected again, and often told a story that is not true about our birth families. So
Absolutely.
I'd love for you to wrap all this up with
absolutely
those, please.
The shroud that adoptees are covered in is partly shame, as you said, mostly gratitude that is forced on you, basically. I don't know if you're watching the show This Is Us, which is a great television series about a lot of adoption theme in it. And just recently, the subject of gratitude came up. And the adopted character in the show, Randall, just said it so well, because his brother accused him. He said, "You sound so ungrateful." It started out with Randall saying, the day I came into this family was the day I lost my other entire family. And his brother says to him, "You sound so ungrateful." And Randall comes back with, "You think I don't know it? You don't think I've spent my entire life hearing how I am supposed to be, expected to be grateful?" So yeah, gratitude is because that's part of the whole myth that it's this wonderful thing. If a wonderful thing is happening to you, then you should feel grateful for it. But it's not a wonderful thing. And then there's all this conflict within both of us. We were told it was a wonderful thing to give our babies away, and you're told it was a wonderful thing to have been adopted. And of course, you as the adoptee would be even more mired in fantasy, because you've heard it from day one. From the time you were knee-high to a grasshopper, you've heard all of these fantasy stories, how we wanted you so much, and your whole life is based on these lies and these fantasies, and the indebtedness and gratitude to those who took you in when you were, quote, unwanted or rejected or abandoned, which is how you feel no matter our good intentions. It certainly creates in the child a feeling of abandonment, which of course we weren't told that our children would feel abandoned and rejected. Part of my personal story, which happened way later on and was not anything to do with my getting involved initially in activism. I told you what got me involved in the activism. It was reading those stories and wondering if my child were dead or alive and well cared for. I had to search for her. I had to find her, and I had to expose all of this. But way later on, when my relinquished daughter, was a young adult, she became one of the statistics of adoption. She successfully suicided. You know that adoptees attempt suicide 4 times more than non-adoptees. Adoptees are overrepresented in all kinds of facilities. They have all kinds, and why wouldn't they? Their whole life is built on a lie. They're gaslighted. They're constantly gaslighted. They're constantly told, these strangers who I look nothing like are my parents. And they're given no recognition for the deep-seated grief that they feel, for the primal wound and trauma that they experienced as infants that are in every cell of their body. That doesn't go away, no matter how loving your adoptive parents are. That trauma is within your body and it doesn't go away, but it's never recognized. And you're supposed to push it down and ignore it and be happy and be grateful. So it's a lot of gaslighting. And I think that adoptees, many, if not all, on some level, suffer from Stockholm syndrome. You're afraid to bite the hand that feeds you. You're afraid of being rejected again. Why wouldn't you be? So you have to play along. You have to play along. You have to put on the smile. You have to never let them know. Most adoptees learn very early on that if they speak about their family of origins, they'll see the tears in their adoptive mother's eyes and they know it's hurtful. And they're decent human beings and they don't want to hurt these wonderful people who are taking care of them. So they push it down and they push it down and they push it down. And it leads to a lot of neurosis. It leads to a lot of craziness. Being gaslighted makes one crazy.
Yeah, you're looking at her.
Result, when your whole life is built on a lie, it's crazy making. Lies are crazy making. And that's the end result. So,
Mirah, thank you for sharing. I did not know that about your daughter.
Because like I said, I don't speak about my own personal situation much.
But I so appreciate that, because that is one of the things that I feel is really important to acknowledge, is that type of pain that would create that moment where somebody says, I can't be here anymore. And it's happening. We are dying from this.
Yes.
And yes. I thank you for sharing that personal part of yourself with us. And
the other reason, Heidi, the other reason I don't talk about her suicide much is I don't want anyone to get the impression, you know how they label adoptees, you're bitter and discontent, right? Adoptees who speak out, adoptees who speak out and want the records open and want changes made. They're bitter and discontent adoptees. And I didn't want people to think that I became an activist out of bitterness that my daughter passed away. One had nothing to do with the other. One came decades after the other. So that's the other reason I don't speak about it too much. But it is a reality. And it's listen, Heidi, you can invite me back 2 or 3 times and I'd still have more to talk about.
We need to do, and if you're willing, I think we need to just have a series with you and keep going as much as you want, because I feel like you're absolutely right. We've only scratched the surface. And if you...
Well, we've talked about what's wrong. And we need to do at least one more of these to talk about my suggestions, my proposals to rectify this horrendous. And the solution is not leaving children in harm's way. That is by no means the solution.
And that's a wonderful lead in, because if you're willing, Mirah,
stay tuned to part 2.
Yes, part 2. Oh, Mirah, this has been an amazing experience with you. Thank you. And there will be a part 2, and hopefully
I sure
part
hope
3.
so. I think it needs that closure. I think it needs
does.
that closure. And I
do
want to
too.
thank you. I really, really want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. What an opportunity to do what I love best and talk about.
Mirah, honestly, I wouldn't have had the strength to get through the writing of the book, which was my granular experience, to be able to move out of my own pain and try to get to a place where I could just be a conduit to process these stories through. And it was the strength of you and Nancy Verrier and, you know, what I call the OGs, the original gangsters.
Oh,
just to have that, like that power and these matriarchs around me. It felt like mothering at a whole nother level. So I'm just so grateful you want to come back. And I think you deserve this space and you deserve to have your voice heard and continue to speak your truth. It matters. So my love to you, Mirah. Please stay well because we have more work to do.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Bye-bye.
Bye.